Good morning, 8th grade. This will be our final video for our 8th grade here. So I want to talk to you guys a little bit about what happened to the United States after the end of the Civil War and how the United States came back together to be a united country. So this time period that we are talking about is what we call Reconstruction. So we are reconstructing the United States and bringing it back together. So Abraham Lincoln, before he was assassinated, he did put together a plan on how he wanted to bring the United States back together, and it's called the 10% Plan. And he basically wanted the southern states to vote, and if 10% of the state's voters swore to be loyal to the United States, they could then take the steps they needed to rejoin the Union. So if they got a 10% vote, they could organize a new government. And then there was a couple things that new government would have to do in order to be allowed to join the United States again. They would have to declare an end to slavery. Then that government could send their representatives to Congress. Part of his plan also offered amnesty to all former Confederates who took an oath of loyalty. Amnesty is basically like forgiveness, because a lot of the South was fighting against the United States. What are you going to do with all those people? Do you allow them to become citizens again? So basically, Lincoln said, yes, we will forgive them as long as they promise to be loyal to the United States. Lincoln was a little bit at odds with other Republicans within his party. He hoped his plan, because it was simple enough, it wasn't super strict, that it would help to establish the Republican Party in the South and make his party popular. There were other Republicans within his party, what we refer to as radical Republicans, that wanted to be much stricter towards the South. They wanted to be a little bit harsher towards the South, because remember, these are the people that broke away and fought a war against the United States. So their concern was, if we're not strict, those same people that were fighting against us are now going to be the same people that are in charge. And they did not believe that that was fair, or that's what should happen. Something that was set up by Congress in March of 1865 is the Freedmen's Bureau. This was set up to provide emergency relief to all of the people, especially in the South, who were affected by the war. A lot of these services are going to be going towards slaves, because now you have millions of people who are suddenly free and have no place to go. They have no education. They don't know how to read or write. So the Freedmen's Bureau is going to be something that's there to help all of these newly freed slaves. It's also going to help anybody who needs help. So it's going to help white Southerners as well. Many of the teachers who go down to the South to work in the Freedmen's Bureau are going to be white women or free African-American women. So they're going to go down there to teach people how to read and write. Remember, there's a lot of white Southerners too, especially the poor white Southerners, who don't know how to read and write either. And this was meant to be a relief organization to help people. And it did do a lot of good, but there was also some corruption in a lot of cases where, money wasn't used properly and things like that. After the Civil War, there were several new amendments added to the Constitution. So 13th Amendment bans slavery, makes it illegal in our country. 14th Amendment gives citizenship to anybody who used to be a slave, so basically making all former slaves now citizens of our country. The 15th Amendment was one of the more controversial ones. So it barred any states from denying African American men the right to vote based on their race or the fact that they were previously a slave. It did not prevent any states from requiring other things for someone to vote. So states are going to pass a lot of laws to try and restrict African American males and their ability to vote. So they're going to pass laws that you have to pay a tax, or that you have to own property, or you have to take a literacy test, which would prevent a lot of African American males from being allowed to vote. Now, who's going to be very upset by this? Ooh, the ladies are not happy. Women are very disappointed because, once again, they still don't get to vote. And the women's rights movement and the leaders in that movement were really big in helping with the war effort. They had also been very active in the abolition movement and spoke out against slavery. They were also helped out a lot during the war and helping with the war effort. And they really felt like, great, once again, women are pushed off to the side. And, they were upset that, once again, they're still not allowed to vote. They were not happy about that at all. This was the first amendment that ever referred to a citizen's rights to vote. And again, it was said specifically for African American males. And one of the things that the women's rights leader said is, okay, well, why don't we just change the amendment? And instead of saying, based on African American males, why don't we say just add the word sex in there, so that way someone cannot be denied the right to vote based on their sex. So that way women and men could vote. And unfortunately, as we know, that didn't go through. And it's going to be 50 more years until women finally do get the right to vote. So a lot of the women's rights leaders were very upset by that amendment because they felt like they were excluded again. All right, so after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, we know that Andrew Johnson, his vice president, took over. And Andrew Johnson has a lot of issues with his presidency. He and Congress do not get along. Okay, Andrew Johnson's kind of an interesting character. He was actually not a Republican, even though Abraham Lincoln was. He was a Southern Democrat, but he was one of the few Southern Democrats that did not agree with seceding from the Union and actually didn't side with the Confederacy. So he and Congress, who's mostly Republicans, just don't see eye to eye on a lot of things. And it gets to the point where Congress decides to try and impeach Johnson. He did violate the Tenure of Office Act. So the Tenure of Office Act was basically a law that said the president couldn't just fire people that Congress has already approved. Well, Andrew Johnson, when he took over the presidency, all of the people in the cabinet were people that Abraham Lincoln had picked and Congress had voted and approved on. He wanted to replace his Secretary of War. His last name was Stanton, and he fired him. And Congress said, well, you can't do that because you're not allowed to fire officials that Congress has already approved. And he tried to replace him with Ulysses S. Grant. Congress reinstated him anyways. He tried to replace him with somebody else, and that's when they brought impeachment charges against him. Okay. Most of his impeachment charges were related to him trying to fire Stanton and get a new Secretary of War. So he's impeached in the House. There's a trial in the Senate, at the Senate trial, as you guys know, if convicted, the president can be removed from office. Johnson escaped impeachment by one vote, so he was almost removed from office. So he barely made it through, but he did make it through, and he wasn't removed from office. And during the next presidential election, Ulysses S. Grant is going to be the leader for the Republican Party. He's a very good pick. He's a very famous Civil War general for the North. So he's going to appeal to a lot of voters. At this time, most of the southern states are still under military rule. They haven't met all the requirements yet to be independent and be a state back in the Union. So during this election, this is going to be the first election where you're going to have a lot of African American voting because the military is down there to make sure and enforce all the voting rules. So you have over 500,000 African Americans are going to vote. Most of them are going to vote mainly for the Republicans because Lincoln was of the Republican Party. So Grant is going to win this election pretty easily. President Grant, he wasn't necessarily a bad president. He just didn't really pick the best people to be part of his office. He often put friends in different positions, but his friends were very corrupt. A lot of them were arrested and tied to all these different scandals. Grant really wasn't involved in them, but it reflected badly on him because these are the people that he chose to be leaders, and then they're corrupt and doing bad things. So it just didn't look very good on him. He's going to be reelected in 1872, but by then the Republican Party is starting to wane, and Northerners are kind of getting tired of them. So by this time, they kind of want things to get back to normal. They want the military to be taken out of the South and kind of let the southern states get back to normal and let them become, states that are part of the United States again. So starting in 1869, we're going to start to see a shift, and the Republican Party is going to start to kind of lose their stronghold in the South. As this is going on, we're also going to start to see that African Americans are going to start to lose the rights that they just got. Okay, so the election of 1876. This is really where historians say that Reconstruction ends with this one. This is one of the few elections where there wasn't a clear winner, and Congress actually had to go back and look at the votes and then decide who won the presidency. And there's a lot of kind of shadiness that went on, but a deal was made that Rutherford B. Hayes would be the president as long as he ended Reconstruction. So one of the first things that he does when he becomes president is he removed all troops from the South and ended the military rule down there in the South. Now, this is when, because the military is not in charge in the South anymore, this is when we're really going to start to see a lot of southern states pass different laws to take away voting rights from African American men. So there's going to be a few different things, a few different laws that states pass in order to ensure that African American men cannot vote. One of them is going to be a poll tax, so you have to pay a tax before you vote. A lot of African Americans couldn't afford to pay the tax because they're just starting their lives. They haven't really built up, any kind of money yet. They also have a literacy test to see if you can read or write. Usually it involves somebody having to read a section of the Constitution and explain it. Even I, as a history teacher, sometimes don't understand what the Constitution's saying. So imagine somebody who maybe just learned how to read, trying to read it and explain it. And then there's also another law called the Grandfather Clause, and it basically said that you didn't have to take this literacy test as long as your grandfather would have been eligible to vote in January of 1867. Well, no African American in the South are going to be able to qualify for this because they didn't get voting rights until 1868. So automatically, they do not get to be part of this Grandfather Clause. And all these laws were intended to specifically target African American males and make sure they couldn't vote. There was lots of loopholes and things that would allow white voters to vote, so they didn't have to pay the taxes. They didn't have to take the literacy test. This was very much focused on just African Americans to make sure that they did not get to vote. Okay. Also during this time, southern states are going to start passing what we call Jim Crow laws. You guys may have heard of this. So these were the laws that enforced the separation of races. So it required separate facilities for white and African American citizens in the South. So, this went down to everything: hospitals, cemeteries, schools, restaurants, playgrounds. Later, public facilities like restrooms, drinking fountains, pools. African Americans would have to sit in the backs of railroad cars or streetcars. Later, when we get buses, sit in the back of buses. And this law was actually held up by the U.S. Supreme Court. So Homer Plessy, he was an African American man, and he decided to basically test this law on whether it was fair that he couldn't get to ride in the white section of railroad cars. And this case went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court actually did rule and said, as long as the facilities are equal, states are allowed to have these types of laws. And as you guys know from what we've talked about with the Civil Rights Movement and everything, These facilities were not equal. Schools for African American children were not the same as the schools that white children were going to. And then, life after the Civil War was very hard for all of these free African Americans. And it wasn't just African Americans, too. A lot of poor white people got wrapped up into this as well. So sharecropping was really big in the South. So sharecropping is basically somebody who works on a farm but doesn't own the land. And they basically do all the farm work in exchange for a share of the value of the crop. So if I'm a big farmer and I have lots of land, I might give 10 acres to someone and say, you can live on my land. You grow whatever, crop you want to grow, let's say cotton. And then when you sell it, you'll give me a portion of the profit. And the landlords supply everything. So they're supplying the land, the living quarters, the tools, the seeds, everything that these people need to live on credit. And then at harvest, whatever money they make from selling the crops, you'll have to pay back your landlord. And unfortunately, most of the time, however much money they owe the landlord for all of those things is not going to be covered by the money that they're making by selling these crops. So they're constantly working themselves into debt. Every season when they harvest and they sell and they make some money, they might pay off a little bit of their debt, but then the next season comes and the person who owns the land lends them more money to buy the seeds and the things that they need. And it's just this constant cycle of debt that these poor farmers are never going to get out of. And it became very popular in the South. So they may not, slavery might be illegal, but this is still kind of like a type of slavery where these people are always in debt to these landowners and they're never going to get out of it. Okay, so like we talked about before the Civil War, agriculture is really big in the South. And that's going to be the first thing that really bounces back. Farms are going to start growing cotton and tobacco. But we're also going to start seeing more industrial things coming down into the South. So you're going to start seeing factories open up to process that cotton, to make it into clothing, to weave it into carpets. You're also going to see a lot of mills popping up in the South. So lumber mills to cut down forests in the South, process it, make it into wood that they could sell. Furniture factories are also going to be start popping up in the South and growing. So yes, agriculture is still a big part of life in the South, but now you're going to start to see the South get those factories and that industry that the North had before the Civil War. So we're going to start to see that as well. So people might stop being farmers and instead go work in one of these factories or these mills. All right, and the last thing really quick, I just want to talk about literature a little bit. After the Civil War, there's going to be some big movements in literature, which you guys are probably going to read about a lot more in high school next year. So transcendentalism, a lot of those writers are really looking at the relationship between humans and nature and how nature affects people. Those writers are going to be people like Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau. Again, you'll probably read about them and read some of their work in high school. This is also the same time when we get pretty famous now, like classic American writers coming out. Herman Melville, he wrote Moby Dick. Nathaniel Hawthorne, he wrote his famous book is The Scarlet Letter. And both of those writers kind of explored, how people think and their psychology and extreme emotion. If you guys have ever read Moby Dick or watched the movie, it's about a guy who's obsessed with this one specific whale and killing it. And then, the Scarlet Letter is all about how this one community treats one of their members. And so all of this writing and this type of literature that comes out, a lot of it has to do with, coming from the Civil War, the fact that the nation just went through this really extreme situation, and how these intellectuals are reacting to it. So you guys will probably study these a lot in high school and read some of their work. And that is the end of the Civil War. So all I want you guys to do is just watch this video today and tomorrow. No work to turn in. If you are missing any work from my class, you have 2 days to turn it in. All work is due at the end of the day on Wednesday. So if you need to turn anything in, that is your last chance. If you have any questions about what you're missing, please let